So how do we even know what a house does or doesn't represent? Most people, in my experience, try to figure out what house is symbolized by reverse engineering their charts. In other words, like I am Y and my chart is X, so obviously X equals Y. This would work if you were really Y, 100% Y and nothing but Y, and your chart was really X and 100% X and nothing but X. But we all know, I think, that that is not even close to the reality. Hence, the results you get from reverse engineering symbolism is not really even close to what it really should be. You'll come up with really weird ideas like, I have a lot of dogs and I have a lot of plants in the 8th house, so obviously the 8th house represents dogs. Well, if that's not the way we should do it, how should we do it? Well, we should have a systematic, logical, rational approach. Okay, fine. I've noticed that some people have systematic, rational approaches, but not very good ones. For example, many people try to use a principle called bavad bhavam, which means houses from houses. First of all, if you use one house to derive the meaning of the other house, how do you get the original meaning of the houses? And second of all, it just doesn't work. So for example, the 3rd house is the 2nd house for the 2nd house. So that means that the 3rd house, which symbolizes selfishness, should nourish and support the 2nd house, which symbolizes family. Or even more obviously wrong, the 4th house is the 12th house for the 5th. So that means the 4th house, the mother, should symbolize the weakening and undoing of the 5th house, which is the child. So this is just total garbage also, but for some reason people like it. If this is not a good approach to figuring out what houses symbolize, then what is? Very simple, just like everything else in astrology. Every symbolism derives directly from what these things really look like and how they actually move and act in the world. For the houses, this simply means how these areas of the sky are related to the horizon. So in the case of the 8th house, it's directly above the 7th. So the 7th house is where the sun and everything else sets. And all the meaning of the 8th house will come from the fact that it's above this. It's above where the sun sets. And so it will be erosive because the sky that's just above the horizon has all the weather in it. So let's look at that in actual detail to see what the 8th house really does and doesn't represent. And let's take 7 very common ideas. So one very common thing that people say is that the 8th house symbolizes death. Now, if I were a teacher and I was grading your homework, I would give you a B for that answer. So a B is not totally bad. It's a pretty decent score because basically if you think the 8th house symbolizes death, your work with the 8th house, your interpretations of the 8th house won't usually be that far off. It's fairly reasonably practically accurate to say the 8th house represents death, but in fact, it does not represent death. Death has to do with the sunset because the sunset represents things going bye-bye. You don't see them anymore. They disappear. They end. And where does the sun set? Does it set in the 8th house? No. It sets in the 7th, but the 8th house derives its meaning from the 7th by eroding the things that are symbolized by the 7th. So it's related to death, but actually the 8th house is the house of longevity. You could also say life force or vitality. Actually, we're getting our ability to survive and persist from the 8th house. And then when that runs out, that's when you die. Hence, the 8th house also has to do with your ability to heal, your healing powers. I would only give that answer an A, though not an A+, because the 8th house by itself is not very generous, and healing requires a generousness in your energy. So really to get healing power from a good 8th house, you need some benefic stuff affecting it, or you need some prominent benefics elsewhere in the chart. The second idea that we'll cover today is that the 8th house symbolizes sex. Well, I'd give that an A. So you might be wondering, why did I grade this an A and not an A+? Because sex has different connotations, some of which are not really 8th house connotations. So like sex in any artistic or beautiful sense, or even in any kind of romantic sense, is not really exactly what the eighth house is about. The eighth house is literally the biological, hormonal drive to have babies. That drive that is hardwired into living organisms. So the sun sets in the seventh house, that means death. The eighth house is erosive of death. It takes away from death. It takes the power away from death. So not only is it your lifespan, but it's your ability to create new life. Now let's take a look at the third idea. A lot of people say that the eighth house symbolizes transformation. To be honest with you, I have no idea how to grade this. I'm not really sure why someone would say the eighth house represents transformation. And one thing that's evident is that when things rise in the east, they enter one hemisphere, the visible hemisphere, and when things set in the west, they enter a very different hemisphere, the underground hemisphere. So that's a transformation. But that would be located in the seventh house. I think maybe this comes a lot from just reverse engineering your charts. Or maybe it's the tendency to try to always be nice. So instead of, dealing with the eighth house as a house of death and stuff like that, you call it the house of transformation, because death is a transformation. So maybe transformation is just a pseudonym for death. Really, I have no idea. So let's move on to the fourth idea about the eighth house. The eighth house symbolizes esoteric things. Bam, you got an A+. You nailed it. The sun sets in the seventh, right? So things become invisible in the seventh house, but in the eighth house, it's preventing things from becoming invisible. So it deals with obscure things and arcane things, and things that are on the verge of disappearing, or things that are very difficult to see. Anything esoteric, so occult. So therefore, under that umbrella, we can say the eighth house has to do with spirituality, mysticism, magic, and guess what? Astrology. The eighth house has to do with psychology for the same reason, because psychology is about the part of us that you don't see, that isn't obvious, the mind. And also, the eighth house has to do with intuition, thought processes which don't have an obvious logical path. Furthermore, on this very theme of dealing with low visibility or invisibility things, we can accurately say that the eighth house symbolizes secrets. So that also means that with the right kind of recipe, it can indicate secrecy or even deception. Now for idea number 5. The eighth house symbolizes bad luck. Sorry, but I would grade this a C-. And it's not because I don't like to say negative things. I love to say negative things. But I just think this is not accurate. The eighth house doesn't really symbolize bad luck. But why would you think that it does? Well, it's reasonable to think that it represents bad luck because it has to do with invisible things. Low visibility often equates to not success, failure, non-prominence, obscurity. So you could translate that into bad luck. But instead of saying bad luck, which is misleading, you should say low visibility. The eighth house signifies low visibility. So it will tend to decrease visibility, and what that will do is it will put things into niches. Like, in other words, if you have fame and fortune, but a very dominant eighth house, your fame will go into a niche limitation. In other words, what the eighth house does to things like career and so forth is it shrinks the pond. You know that saying, a big fish in a small pond? The eighth house tends to shrink the pond, and so people could think that means bad luck. Also, another reason people would think the eighth house has to do with bad luck is because of its, like we mentioned, connection with secrecy, and therefore it can enable bad or forbidden actions. The sixth idea about the eighth house is that it symbolizes scrutiny. Bingo. A+. You got it right. Why? Exactly the same reason. It's because it has to do with invisible and low visibility things. That means the eighth house can see the shit that you are hiding. That bit that you covered up with the cover up, that bit that you swept under the rug, that part that you're trying to smile and hide, the eighth house sees it anyway. So if you're in the presence of the eighth house, you will feel highly scrutinized. It's not a very likable house, but it's not a bad luck house. It's just a scrutinizing house. Scrutinizing can be great for certain things, like maybe you want to do research or discover something that was unknown before. The eighth house also enables people to be excellent in exposition. Exposition means taking something unknown and making it clear, making it displayed. And the eighth house, of course, is extremely good for critique and criticism. If you want to be a critic of something, or if you need to debug something, then you need to call on the eighth house for that. So this is why the eighth house has great utility in any kind of scientific or technological field. The seventh and final idea that you guys came up with about the eighth house is that it symbolizes inheritance. Well, I'll give you an A for that. Then you may say, come on, I need that deserves an A+. Actually, it just deserves an A because the eighth house isn't really limited to just inheritance. It's about more than that. So to explain this, we're finally going to take another aspect of what the sunset symbolizes. All along, we've just been looking at the sunset as its main symbolism of disappearance. But also the sunset symbolizes other people. And the reason for that is that the sunrise symbolizes yourself. And then when that thing sets, it becomes non-prominent. And as the prominence of the self decreases, the prominence of others increases. And hence the seventh house, where the sun sets, has to do with other people and our relationship to them. Now the eighth house is directly above the seventh house. So it's eroding it and it's drawing from and it's evaporating from the seventh house. So what does that mean? That means the eighth house is about the way that we get stuff from other people. Inheritance is just one way. So really, fully what the eighth house symbolizes, if you want an A+ for this answer, it's money that you are given by others. Or maybe with the wrong or right permutations of the eighth house, it's money that you take from others. In other words, it's not money that you earn in a common, like paid by the hour or paid by the job type of salary. It's money that people give you either because they love you or because they have some obligation to you or because they feel indebted towards you or something like that. So you can also think of the eighth house as dependent money. It's money that you aren't really independently creating, but it's money that you are depending on others to supply you with. And also, therefore, you can think of it as shared wealth or partnered wealth, and often it is called the wealth that's obtained through marriage. So for a quick review, what does the eighth house symbolize? Well, we broke it down to life force, reproduction, the esoteric, scrutiny, and shared wealth. We pared it down to these 5 main categories of symbolisms because we got rid of transformation and bad luck. Some of the direct implications of these keywords is the life force. This means longevity and also vitality. Reproduction has to do with fertility and the actual biological sex drive. Esoteric has to do with the occult, psychological, niche things and nichification of things, and also secretification of things, or dealing with secrets. Scrutiny has to do with research, discovery, exposition, and critique. And shared wealth is all about gifts, donations, and the benefits of partnerships. Now, it's not done yet. I want to give you a little bonus. There was a lot of other ideas expressed in the comments thread. So let's just quickly grade those. Some people said the eighth house represents the afterlife. Unfortunately, I would grade that a D. It's not actually the afterlife, it's death. And even that is a stretch because actually the eighth house is near longevity, which just secondarily determines the death. So really don't look at the eighth house for your afterlife. Look at the 12th. Another idea is that the eighth house symbolizes your ambitions. Again, I would give that a D, I'm sorry. Maybe you're thinking it represents ambitions because it represents sex drive, and sex drive is 60 to 90% of what creates our ambitions in most cases. But really, you're barking up the wrong tree if you're thinking of the eighth house as ambitions. The third house is the house of ambitions. The eighth house is the house of sex drive. Some people said that the eighth house symbolizes your beliefs. I would definitely give this a D at best. The only thing I can think of is you might actually just be mistaking this for psychology. The eighth house is about psychology, which is about what's inside your mind, and your beliefs are inside your mind. Okay. But if you really want to understand people's beliefs in terms of like their religious or philosophical beliefs, don't look at the eighth house, look at the ninth. Or if you want to know their beliefs and like what their values are, look at the ninth and the fourth. Another thing people thought was that the eighth house represents your hidden motives. I give this one an A+. Maybe I'm overgrading it, but I just think it's a great insight into the eighth house. Really, the motives of the third house, like we said, but the eighth house is your hidden stuff. So the secrecy of the eighth house, and with it also having some sex drive, you could say that it is symbolizing the hidden motives of a person. Somebody said that the eighth house represents power. We give that one a D. Sorry. I guess you're thinking that the eighth house represents vitality, and vitality is power. But the problem is that the word power sounds like how much influence I have in society or how much control I have over other people. So that's not the eighth house. So if you want to see somebody's power, don't try to interpret the eighth house. Look at the 10th house, look at the third house, look at the sixth house. Someone else said the eighth house has to do with trauma. I give this one a C. Like we said, the eighth house has to do with psychology. And trauma is an aspect of psychology, so why don't I give trauma an A? Because trauma is a specifically negative aspect of psychology, and you shouldn't do that. When you're thinking about what a house represents, you should avoid putting it in an inherently positive or negative framework. Because the positivity or negativity of the house depends on how it's configured in the chart. So just think of the eighth house as psychology, you'll be better off. If your eighth house is abused by the planets, then it's going to have traumas. Then it would represent traumas, but it doesn't intrinsically represent traumas. Someone else said that the eighth house represents sorrows. I would also give that a C, and for the same exact reason. Sure, the eighth house does have to do with psychology and emotions, but no, the eighth house is not intrinsically negative. No house is. Some people said that the eighth house symbolizes crisis. That's another C. Actually, the eighth house represents unexpected events. Why? Because it's about things that are difficult to see. So if the eighth house isn't well configured, then you won't be working very well with unexpected things. You'll encounter a lot of unexpected things. If conversely the eighth house is working well, you will know all about the invisible and difficult to see things, and you won't have any unexpected things. So crisis is not really a good term to ascribe to the eighth house because it assumes the eighth house is negative. Same thing with dangers. Somebody else said the eighth house represents dangers. Dangers just means unexpected things popping out at you that were negative, inherently negative. So the problem with saying that eighth house represents crisis or dangers is that you're inherently imposing negativity on what it represents. It just represents unforeseen or difficult to foresee things. Somebody said that the eighth house represents contracts. I'll give that one a C, only because maybe you're thinking about the wealth that comes with partnerships. The eighth house does legitimately symbolize the wealth that we have from our partnerships. And so that might involve contracts, right? Not really. It's not really contractual stuff in the eighth house. If you want to understand the contractual side of life, don't try to interpret the eighth house. You'd be much better off interpreting the sixth. Someone else said that the eighth house has to do with loans. I give it a C, and for the same exact reason. That's not really the kind of partnered wealth that comes out of the eighth house loans. That comes from the sixth. Someone else said that the eighth house represents subterranean things. And finally, I will give that another A+. Because that is literally exactly what the eighth house is about, hidden things, and things which are underground are very hidden. So the eighth house will often symbolize a cave or a chasm or the underground, even in a cultural sense, or under the sea. Things that come out of the ground, mining, drilling. Someone said the eighth house represents taxes. I'm going to give that one a B. Why am I giving it a B and not a lower score? Because the eighth house really is about the money that you get from others, kind of like as gifts and so forth. Taxes really is just the exact opposite of that. So that means that if the eighth house is configured in such a way that you're getting negative effects to it, then instead of getting money for sort of no reason, then you'll be losing money for sort of no reason, which is perfectly explained as taxes. But really, if you want to understand taxes more directly, it's better to leave the eighth house sort of out of it or make it secondary. Focus more on the sixth house and the 10th house. Someone else said the eighth house has to do with your in-laws. I'll also give that one a B. The reason is that the eighth house has to do with what you gain through your partnerships, the wealth that you gain through your partnerships like marriage, so that can be your spouse's family. Also, the only valid way to use the Bhavat Bhavam principle of houses from houses is to figure out the more distant family relationships. And so saying that the eighth house is the second for the seventh has validity and makes sense only in that context, and that would support that it has to do with your in-laws. So why did I give it a B, however, not an A or an A+? Because you can't really, you need more than just the eighth house to understand the in-laws. Your mother-in-law, you will want to see the fourth house from the seventh. Your father-in-law, the 10th house from the seventh, with the eighth house. Okay, one other person said the eighth house represents intensity. I would also give this one, generously maybe, a B. Because if you're in the presence of scrutiny, you feel intense, and the scrutinizer feels intense to you. And the eighth house is all about scrutiny. Also, the sex house has sex drive, and that also increases a person's sort of aggression and intensity. Finally, somebody said the eighth house represents plumbing, which at first I laughed at. And what is this person talking about? But actually, when I thought about it for half a second more, I realized this is a pretty reasonable, good answer, actually. So I'd give that one an A, and you know why? Because that really does summarize in an obscure way what the eighth house is all about. It's about the things which are not obvious. And the plumbing is the stuff that's inside the walls. Yet it has a definite effect in the actual house itself. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.